Tonda, the 2025 Saudi Arabian Grand Prix, long anticipated. And we expected probably a lot because of the DRS zones.
Yeah.
You have a few, it's a high-speed circuit. We expected Red Bull to be strong. We expected McLaren to be strong. More importantly, we maybe expected Ferrari to be stronger, but what do you think? How did you enjoy the Grand Prix?
Well, I think obviously we need to talk about the elephant in the room, and that is Oscar Piastri overtaking Lando Norris in the first place of the World Championship currently. And I think what we predicted at the start of the year is starting to come true. And I think we talked about this last year even. And that is that Oscar Piastri is getting his elbows out. He's no longer satisfied with, doing whatever McLaren tells him to do and help Lando Norris out. And I think we'll see a real championship battle. We're already seeing it. Oscar Piastri is really making the moves and, again, getting his elbows out, as we saw in that, first turn. But, well, that was Max Verstappen once again.
Yeah.
So these two, we saw Max Verstappen and Lando Norris fighting quite a bit last year. Some of it was quite on edge, right? On the line of what is allowed and what is not allowed. But what do you make of Piastri and the fight with Verstappen?
Yeah, I mean, exactly as you mentioned, we talked about it last year, right? And I think many people expected that this year will kind of be the repeat, maybe, of a little bit of the turntables for Norris versus Verstappen, right? For the championship. But we said it. We thought that Piastri was on a great streak and that maybe he had just some things to polish out and that he might be even the biggest championship favorite. Even though, for example, Russell, was in I think it was the F175 event, he was patting Norris on the back saying, look, this is your championship favorite, right? But yeah, I think qualifying just proved it once again because, I think Lando Norris gets reminded very in a harsh way that having the best car is not the only thing that matters because it is very hard to extract every single millisecond you need to get the pole position because, Max Verstappen got on pole ahead of Piastri, but, the gap was less than a tenth. And that was even to Russell, I think, the top three being around a tenth of a difference. And Lando Norris binned it in Q3.
Yeah.
On his first lap. Again, making his life quite a bit more difficult for the Sunday's race. The same as, Bahrain, except for not crashing. And he had to make up a lot of places, on the Sunday. And it didn't go as plain sailing, as it was in perhaps Bahrain on the opening lap. And that's where he, I think, lost the chance for perhaps the podium or the race win. But yeah, I think that Verstappen might have found his match because, lap 1, turn 1, we had the famous, Verstappen kind of braking so late that he will just be ahead at the apex, never making the corner, staying ahead, and receiving a 5-second penalty. What do you make of the move? Do you think the maneuver was a good one from Piastri, or do you think the penalty was harsh, unfair, or how do you see this coming?
I think it's getting really weird with the penalties and the moves. And that is because last year there were some precedents set, also kind of partially due to Max Verstappen and his moves, And sometimes you see people, now acknowledging that, okay, if you say that is how we're gonna play, that's how we're gonna play, which kind of leads to situations like this. But with this specific case, it was what it was. It was what it was. I think we can say that, as always, we wish for more consistent and logical, or at least logical seeming rules for these things, but I'm not sure. What do you make of the situation?
I agree with the penalty for one reason. And the thing is, Piastri, he just did what he had to do. I think he just, he did brake late, but he was making the apex. He was pushing out, but Verstappen, but he was entitled to that corner. And kind of before the braking zone, Piastri was actually ahead. And the thing that Verstappen should have probably done was just to concede, the place
and avoid
on the outside.
The penalty.
And avoid the penalty. Exactly. The biggest thing that I had, with the problem was for me, Verstappen intentionally just, brakes later just for the sake of it, to be ahead at the apex, just to kind of, abuse these rules.
Exactly.
But then he never has the intention of making the corner. So if the maneuver was that Piastri was pushing out Verstappen, and Verstappen would be easily making the corner around the outside and was ahead of the apex, then I would be, I would be against the penalty, because, then Verstappen would just be entitled to space around the outside. I think a lot of confusion comes when, for example, when you have lap 1 incidents, seems like stewards are more lenient towards those.
Yeah.
But then you have so many also confusing rules about who's the attacking car, who's the defending car. A lot of it is, I think, very, as you say, unclear. But this incident for me was pretty clear because, Verstappen never intended to make the corner. He just, overtook Piastri outside the track and decided not to give the position back, which from racing perspective, from Verstappen's perspective, I do understand, because I think that the McLaren had, the pace to just go away if Verstappen was not in the clean air and Piastri was in the clean air. I think, Piastri would be never seen again. But for once, we see someone taking it to Verstappen and actually not budging. So that was a nice change, for example. And that, for me, is one thing that perhaps Lando Norris should learn with Verstappen especially.
And, my question to you is, what do you think is going on through Lando Norris's head at the moment? Last year, you start out as not an underdog, but you start out in a car that nobody's really expecting to be fighting for wins. And you're going up against a guy who has had the most dominant couple of seasons that we've ever seen, basically, in F1. And suddenly you start winning, right? You have the first win in Miami, and then you start fighting this guy. And he's clearly, he's not always handling it. So he's, we saw like the fight in Austria, for example, last year. But then you really bring the fight to him. You win a lot of races, and the car gets quicker. But then at the very end of the season, it just slips away. Max takes it. But that you have this year, that the car is looking fast. It's only getting faster, while the Red Bull seems to be getting slower. But now, with the new year, it's your teammate who seems to be taking the fight to Max Verstappen. It's not you anymore. Or it's not just you, at the very least. Even though we saw Oscar Piastri win a couple of races last year as well, this time he's really checking them off. What do you think? How would you feel in this situation, being Lando Norris?
That's a good question, and I think if you look at the interviews of Lando Norris, he's crushed every time he makes. He knows it. He knows he has to be on his A game. His teammate is not Nicholas Latifi. His teammate is someone who won pretty much everything that he entered. He is incredible, and I'm not sure I think this was his 50th Grand Prix start, which just goes to show, oh my God, there's so much potential in Piastri, and he already, at this point, has the same number of victories as Lando Norris. So
exactly. Another.
So I think that, although he might say that it's okay, and then he's going to do a better job, and that it doesn't bother him as much, I think it bothers him, it bothers him a lot. That's my opinion, and I think he's under pressure, and it's easy to say that I think it is still very new for Norris, because last year he just focused on kind of, last year he was never in the position before Miami to win a race or to have won a race. So it kind of is everything, just a little bit new. But at the same time, his experience, it's not small. So I think he kind of needs to get on top over it. So he's not really in with with the car. So yeah, I think he's just struggling a little bit. And Piastri is just using that. And he's absolutely smashing everything he needs to do. What would you think? What would be going through your head? Because I agree. It's difficult.
Definitely. And I agree with your point that Lando definitely seems to be the type of person to be quite harsh on himself. And you can also see that it's quite visible, in the last Drive to Survive season as well, where it really is framed as, Max the Terminator versus Lando, who's kind of, a bit on the, I don't want to say insecure because that's that's a hard side, but if we exaggerate, but a bit, maybe less, he blames himself for the mistakes, and I think it gets to his head a bit. While Oscar really seems to be staying just calm.
I think I have a good comparison. I feel like Norris is behaving a little bit like Leclerc did at the start of his Ferrari stint. Because when Leclerc started, at Ferrari, you heard a lot, him blaming himself, him wearing his heart on the sleeve, kind of, even though I'm pretty sure, these drivers are the best in the world. It's just the emotion when you get out of the car. They display it a little bit more. And I think that also then you had the radio calls of Leclerc saying, I'm stupid, and, everything like this. And I feel like Norris is a little bit at the same place, realizing he can actually win. And then, last year we had these radio messages as well. He fumbled a good lap in Qatar or somewhere, and he's saying, sometimes I'm pretty bad. And, Oscar Piastri he's very stable. He's the new Iceman. He is the new Kimi Räikkönen. And I think that also a big role in this case is Mark Webber, the manager of Oscar Piastri. He was, I think, it's hard to say, probably not in the same situation, but he was in a situation where, he was with a world champion, with Sebastian Vettel in Red Bull. So with a very competitive teammate and a young one as well. And he was I think back then, Christian Horner's favorite, and I think that Webber helps Piastri a lot when it comes to, his mindset, working with the mechanics. And I think that maybe Lando Norris is missing somebody like this, maybe somebody like Mika Häkkinen or, somebody who could help him just kind of get through all of this F1 stuff, all of these emotions. So, maybe we found the solution.
Maybe we found the solution for Lando Norris and McLaren, either hire a therapist or a mentor of Mika Häkkinen or some other former world champion. I mean, Mika Häkkinen's still on his sabbatical, right? He could, who knows? If he doesn't come back to driving, maybe he could take up this role of.
I mean, Mika Häkkinen was the mentor of Valtteri Bottas, I think, for a good few years. So and I think it did help Bottas. When you look at the years he was at the Mercedes, I think he struggled a lot. For example, if you remember 2018, he went winless, one puncture in Baku when he was in the lead, and Sochi 2018 where he had to give the position by James to Hamilton. So, and I think that took a lot from him. Then we had the whole Bottas 2.0. But I think a mental coach, for example, is very important. That's also probably why Angela returned to the Ferrari paddock with Lewis Hamilton. Haven't seen much of her, but I think that could make a difference when Hamilton will finally find his feet in Ferrari, which doesn't seem to be happening really. He was struggling again this weekend.
Yeah, I mean Ferrari, they, it's a bit sad to see, right? I mean, I think there were some high hopes for this season, especially with a whole new car.
Yeah.
Coming from last year.
New car concept.
And now what we now saw a podium from Leclerc and a brilliant drive actually, but I think unless we see some big leaps made in Miami and Imola, then we might be reaching a point in the season where Ferrari just says, well, okay, well, screw it. We're focusing on 2026. And if that happens, it's going to be a rough rest of the year for the duo in red.
Yeah.
And I think it's not unrealistic that Oscar Piastri overtakes Charles Leclerc in the number of wins.
Yeah. I mean, how many does Charles Leclerc have? 6, 7?
Yeah. Around that number, yeah.
Not entirely sure. I'll just have a look. Yeah. He has 8. Okay.
8. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's not far at all. If he's already at 5, 3 more races and here we go. Yeah. But so Ferrari didn't. Yeah, Ferrari kind of is a mixed bag, right? Because I feel like Charles Leclerc had a brilliant drive.
Yep.
A brilliant one, because he qualified well. I don't think there's much more pace in the car when it comes to qualifying. But his race pace was actually surprising, and in a good way for once, And Hamilton did maybe help him a little bit, because Hamilton absolutely schooled Lando Norris when it came to the DRS games,
Yeah, we saw a repeat of basically Max Verstappen and Charles Leclerc in 2022, with them, going back and forth. Ended up eventually with the Red Bull driver on top. This time McLaren. Lando Norris made it through, but it is possible that Hamilton held him up just enough for him not to catch up to Charles in the end.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, in the end, Lando Norris didn't manage to catch or overtake Charles Leclerc, and therefore Lando Norris had to be satisfied with P4 only. And we had a Ferrari podium. Finally, Leclerc on the podium.
Yeah.
That's a great thing. And the stint he did, the tire degradation he had, it was insane. It felt like he was on a different planet. And at certain parts of the race, he was the quickest man on track, which was encouraging.
It truly was. I think, what Ferrari is really struggling with right now is the qualifying pace.
Yeah.
Compared to, especially also the teams like Red Bull and Mercedes. Because they're really, I think they're, now sometimes even getting with a Williams getting in front of them. So.
Yeah, exactly. And speaking of Williams, Williams had double points, 8th and 9th, I think, using the Carlos Sainz smooth operator from Singapore technique, holding Albon in the DRS so that Hajar on the medium tires could not overtake either of them, which was very smart. But I think also just goes to show how Williams genuinely is making progress, and despite not having a completely new car, they seem to be quite a bit on the better note than they were last year.
Yeah.
Seems like the James Vowles strategy is paying off. We always said we believe in him. Let him cook.
Yeah, exactly. I agree. But now we might be getting closer to finally mentioning also what we predicted for the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix. And I have to say, I did not do too bad with my prediction for this Grand Prix, because I said that after we saw Max Verstappen struggling in Bahrain and finishing P6, that the favors will, the scales of fate will tip in his favor once again, and that he would be on the podium, which, he qualified. We qualified first, actually, and ended up P2. So I do get a little point in our prediction competition. How did your prediction go?
I went for a bold prediction of saying that the race will have a battle for the win within the last 5 laps of the race, and did not quite happen, did it?
That was bold. That was bold.
Unless you count the fact where, and I don't even think that happened in the last 5 laps, the fact that Oscar Piastri saw almost a red flag like light,
Yeah,
it just seemed like
from the balcony.
Yeah. Turn whatever it was, you just saw from his onboard that there was a red light flashing from the balcony, and it looked identical to a electronic red flag, which was quite bizarre, I might say. But yeah, I get 0 points again. Hopefully better luck next time. But let's try and see who is your driver of the weekend, Tonda, from the top teams. And might I add, I am starting to feel like Williams is not anymore in the... I'm starting to think that we can almost have the first 5 teams and the last 5 teams, because Williams is
we're
kind of closer to the top 5.
Closer to Ferrari specifically, which is...
Yeah, sadly.
Who are kind of, the missing link, so to speak. But yeah, well, you raise a good point. From the top 5 teams, who did we see the driver of the weekend? I know we say this every weekend, but for now I still will say Oscar Piastri, because he's just running away with it.
Yeah,
he's just running away with it. But who would your driver of the weekend from the top 5 be? I'm assuming somebody from Williams.
No, actually, I'm still considering, to make it easier for ourselves, I'm gonna consider Williams to be in the bottom. Okay-ish field. Maybe that might change. They might swap with Ferrari, hopefully not. But for me, the driver of the weekend was Charles Leclerc. And I think that he genuinely could not do anything better in that Ferrari than being on the podium. And, great job to him keeping one McLaren behind. Yeah, there is nothing to add. Like, he did an overcut. He was so quick on the used medium tires. That was so surprising.
Yep.
Because when you looked at Hamilton, he was just overheating. He was just sliding everywhere. Seemed like he was having, a nightmare of a race. And Leclerc had a brilliant race. No mistakes, really, So, for me, he's the driver of the weekend. But who would be your bottom field driver of the weekend?
Well, now it's quite difficult whether we're talking Williams or not. But if not, I will say Isaac Hadjar. He's the one rounding the points off. And for somebody in his rookie season, and now with already 2 different teammates, I think he's showing that he's, quite the talent. So I would have to choose him, even though he gets stuck behind the DRS trick of James Vowles' boys.
The cabrono. For me, if we count in Williams, I think Carlos Sainz, because finally you could see he transferred the qualifying performance to the race. He qualified well. He out-qualified Alexander Albon again, and he finished ahead of him in the race. So that was brilliant. And Isaac Hadjar, amazing race. I think, he is at this point, he's really pressuring Liam Lawson. I think that, that might be another career that has been destroyed by Red Bull, because Lawson seems to be just not finding his feet. And Hadjar is, he's brilliant. Yeah. Like, he's doing a brilliant job. And
who knows, maybe he'll end up in Red Bull before the season is over.
Exactly, especially because, when you look at Tsunoda, he just crashed with Gasly, with his former teammate. I think it was opening lap or...
Yeah.
And Gasly, a shame. He had a pretty good qualifying performance within the top 10. In that tractor of an Alpine, but it was a shame not to see what he would be capable of. But the Red Bull story is a never-ending one.
I agree, but then who would you say is your winner of the weekend?
My biggest winner is Oscar Piastri, because he's leading the championship for the first time. He's the first, I think, Australian driver to do it since Mark Webber, which has been 15 years already, I think. Quite a long time. Perfect execution. Your teammate, binning it.
Yeah.
And not even managing to get on top of the podium. You outraced Max Verstappen. Yep. You held your own. nothing to add. I think he did a brilliant job, and Piastri's overtake on Hamilton was pretty savage as well. Around the outside in that high-speed turn, that was pretty ballsy. Who would be your biggest winner or winners?
Well, I think we're kind of on the same page here, because I was going to say Charles Leclerc for the winner, actually. Just in the sense of finally getting that Ferrari on the podium and showing, that there's still some pace in that car, and he drove brilliantly, which showed, that there might be hope for us Ferrari fans. So, when we combine the two categories, I think we agree quite a bit. But then, loser of the weekend. I think for myself, we already touched upon it, but I was thinking it before. I mean, not out of by fault of his own, but Yuki Tsunoda. I think there was a lot of hype surrounding his ascent to Red Bull, and I think now that's just a bit kind of fizzling away in a way. I mean, I don't think anybody really expected big things from him, but now this is just another unfortunate situation for him.
Yeah, I agree. But for myself, the biggest losers for me was probably Aston Martin, because they're nowhere. I think both the drivers got lapped.
Yeah.
Finishing well outside the points. Lance Stroll is the only driver to score points. His back must be suffering, because he's carrying the whole Aston Martin on his back at this point. But yeah, it seems like Aston Martin has absolutely no pace, and funny thing where Alonso as well, he was racing, and there was Bortoleto in front of him, and they had like a millimeter near collision. That would have been not good for Bortoleto, because probably the management fees of Fernando Alonso would go significantly up, which
very likely.
Yeah, wouldn't be nice, but Aston Martin is just struggling, I think so, and the car just doesn't seem good anywhere. So, and with that, I think it's time to make our predictions for the Miami Grand Prix, and that might be pretty funny in comparison to what I just said, but we'll just show how bold it is. Go for it.
Well, I think that the streak will continue, and that Oscar Piastri will remain P1 in the Drivers' Championship standing, and that he won't be overtaken by Lando Norris if he'll keep his head in the game and do what's.
I mean, we have a sprint weekend, necessary. So a lot of points on the table. So I think the gap is like 10 points. So I think that can be bold, because Miami, as we know, is the lucky place for a certain Lando Norris. So we'll see if Oscar Piastri can hold his own against him. But my prediction is that Fernando Alonso will finally score points. And that would, I think, if he did not score the points the next weekend and then the weekend after, he would equal his worst, start to the season, which was, I think, the 2017 McLaren Honda days, where the car was absolutely abysmal. He was, I think, pointless for the first 7 races, so I hope for Fernando's sake he's going to score some points, but I guess we'll have to see.
Very true. But how would you rate the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix?
I'm going to say it was probably a 6 out of 10 for me.
I agree. Solid 6.
Yeah.
Not too great, not too terrible.
Exactly. We had some racing. We had the battle for the lead, at least in turn 1. And we've had Norris coming through the field, and we had a brilliant drive by Leclerc and interesting strategy by the Williams boys. So, I think it was a solid race, but to be honest, I was expecting a little bit more from Jeddah. And seems like, we're getting towards the end of these regulations, and the cars are just, giving out more and more dirty air. And maybe that's, counter argument to what we were saying to keep regulations for longer. This is an argument, to argue against that. I think if you just look at 2022, the racing was incredibly close. It was so much easier to follow. And now we're back to 2021 levels, of cars. Just, it's super hard to follow, dirty air, having to use different lines, overheating the tires behind cars. So yeah, we're getting towards the end of the car's potentials, I think. So it will be interesting to see at Miami, because I think Miami is not especially an easy track to overtake on.
Yeah. Especially since it might rain, apparently, according to some weather forecast.
Yeah, exactly. So we'll see. That could make some mayhem, because I don't think we ever had rain in Miami so far in those past 2 years, right?
And we've seen Max Verstappen win every time so far.
Have we? No, except for last year, where Lando Norris won.
Oh yeah, what am I saying?
Tonda.
Never mind.
You are getting tired, mate.
But let's see what Miami brings to the table. And we will be here once again to talk about it. So stay tuned and see you next time.
Thank you, and see you next time. Goodbye.